What would you do if the one person who made you feel alive again turned out to be the darkest mistake of your life? In this gripping tale of passion, betrayal, and deadly secrets, we follow Ava, a married woman trapped in a loveless marriage, who embarks on a steamy affair with a mysterious stranger, Julian. But as their fiery romance escalates, the lines between love and manipulation blur, and the ultimate price for desire is murder. Would you risk everything for a love that could destroy you? Do you think Ava deserved redemption, or was her fate sealed the moment she crossed the line? If you love stories full of romance, twisted betrayal, and shocking twists, make sure to comment your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. What would you have done in Ava's shoes? Let's get the conversation started. Subscribe now and join us for more thrilling stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Ava stood at the edge of the resort's infinity pool, the vibrant blues of the ocean stretching endlessly before her. The sound of the waves crashing below offered a soothing escape, something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Her marriage to Michael had grown cold, their conversations reduced to routine, and their connection fading with each passing day. This vacation was supposed to be a chance to reset, to breathe without the weight of her home life. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was searching for something, though she didn't know what. It wasn't until she met Julian that she began to understand. It had started innocently enough, a shared glance by the bar. Ava had been ordering a drink, distracted by her thoughts, when a deep voice interrupted her reverie. "Let me get that for you." She looked up to find Julian, a tall, dark-haired man with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. His charm was magnetic, and the smile that followed his words was enough to make her heart skip. Normally, Ava would have brushed off such attention, but something about Julian pulled her in from the moment he spoke. "Thanks," she said softly, unable to suppress the smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They sat together for hours that first night, talking about everything and nothing. Julian was captivating, with stories of world travels and a mysterious air that left her wanting to know more. His presence was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the predictable, distant relationship she had with Michael. The air between them crackled with tension, and by the time they finished their second round of drinks, Ava could feel the pull of something undeniable. When Julian leaned in, brushing a stray hair from her face, the heat of his touch ignited a spark she hadn't felt in years. "You deserve more," he whispered, his voice low, sending shivers down her spine. And she believed him. The next evening, Ava found herself walking down the dimly lit corridor of the hotel, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent all day trying to rationalize the pull she felt toward Julian, but logic had no place in what was happening. By the time she reached his door, her resolve had crumbled completely. Julian answered almost as if he had been waiting for her, his smile slow and seductive. Before she could say anything, he stepped forward, his hands gently cradling her face, and kissed her. It was a kiss unlike any she had ever experienced, hungry, passionate, and filled with the intensity of their mutual desire. Ava's body responded instantly, every nerve ending alight with the electricity between them. She didn't stop him as he led her inside, didn't resist when his hands began to explore her skin. The moment their bodies pressed together, any lingering thoughts of guilt melted away, replaced by a consuming need she hadn't realized she was capable of. They spent the night lost in each other, their connection more than just physical. Julian made her feel wanted, desired, alive in a way she hadn't been in so long. The intensity of their lovemaking was exhilarating, and the tenderness with which he touched her was addictive. As their clothes scattered across the floor, Ava found herself surrendering to the moment, the feel of Julian's skin against hers, the heat of his breath on her neck. It was more than lust, it was escape. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to let go completely. Lying in Julian's arms afterward, the weight of what she had done slowly crept in. She thought of Michael, of the life they had built together, of the promises she had made. But as she looked at Julian, his hand tracing lazy circles on her bare back, she pushed those thoughts aside. For now, she didn't want to think about anything but the here and now. "I've never felt like this," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. "You deserve to feel this way, Ava, to be loved, to be wanted." His words wrapped around her like a spell, and despite the guilt simmering just beneath the surface, she couldn't help but believe him. Julian was everything she had been missing: adventure, passion, desire. And though she knew it was dangerous, she didn't want to let it go. As the night wore on, they made love again, slower this time, each touch a promise of the connection they had formed. The guilt was still there, lurking in the background, but for now, Ava was willing to let it linger in the shadows. This was her chance at happiness, she told herself. With Julian, everything felt different, new, and exciting. And even if it meant losing everything, Ava wasn't sure she could turn back. Ava returned home from her vacation, but her mind was far from Oakwood Avenue. Michael greeted her with his usual detached politeness, asking about her trip while barely looking up from his work emails. The routine felt suffocating, and all she could think about was Julian, the way his hands felt on her skin, the way he made her feel alive again. Over the following days, her thoughts drifted constantly to him. She replayed their nights together, the heat of their bodies tangled in passion, and the tenderness he showed her afterward. Julian had opened a door inside her that she could no longer close. The thought of returning to her mundane life with Michael felt unbearable. And then Julian called. His voice was smooth, deep, filled with a confidence that instantly reignited the fire within her. "I miss you, Ava, when can I see you again?" Her heart skipped a beat. She knew this was dangerous, that she was playing with fire, but the pull was too strong. She made up an excuse, an evening out with friends, and met him at a secluded bar on the outskirts of town. The moment their eyes met across the dimly lit room, the distance between them melted. Julian pulled her into his arms without hesitation, his lips capturing hers in a hungry kiss. It was as if time had stopped, and all that mattered was this forbidden connection they shared. The tension was palpable, the electricity between them undeniable. "I've been thinking about you every minute," Julian whispered against her neck, his breath hot and intoxicating. "I can't stop." Ava shivered, the guilt gnawing at her only momentarily before it was drowned out by her desire for him. She kissed him back fiercely, unable to resist the magnetic pull between them. The passion that surged through her was overwhelming, unlike anything she had ever experienced with Michael. They spent the night together again, in a hidden corner of the city where no one knew them. Their lovemaking was intense, filled with the urgency of stolen time. Julian's hands explored her body as if he could never get enough, and Ava surrendered completely to him, her mind consumed by the pleasure he offered. But it wasn't just the physical connection that kept drawing her back to Julian, it was the way he made her feel. He listened to her, whispered sweet promises in her ear, and painted a picture of a life where she could be free. Free from Michael. Free from the hollow marriage that had trapped her for years. As they lay together, Julian gently caressed her hair. "Ava, you deserve so much more than this. You deserve to be loved, to be truly happy." Ava sighed, the weight of her double life heavy on her chest. "I can't just leave him. Michael, he's not a bad man. It's just..." He doesn't love you," Julian interrupted softly. "Not the way you deserve to be loved." His words stung with a painful truth that she had been avoiding for years. Michael had grown distant, cold, and while their marriage wasn't filled with outright conflict, it was void of passion. Julian made her feel seen, wanted, and alive in ways she had forgotten. "You don't have to live like this," Ava, Julian continued, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "Leave him. We can be together. I'll take care of you. I'll give you the life you deserve." The idea hung in the air between them, tantalizing and dangerous. Could she really walk away from her marriage, from the life she had built with Michael? The thought filled her with both dread and excitement. Over the next few weeks, Julian's influence grew stronger. He called her daily, planting seeds of doubt about her marriage. He painted a picture of a future where they were together, free from the confines of her old life. Each conversation left Ava more confused, but also more enthralled by him. She found herself lying to Michael more frequently, inventing excuses to meet Julian late-night rendezvous in secret hotel rooms, hurried kisses stolen in alleyways. Julian seduced her not just with his body, but with his words. He made her believe that she was worth more, that she deserved happiness, that their love was real. And slowly, Ava started to believe him. The lines between right and wrong blurred as she became more entangled in the affair. At home, Ava avoided Michael as much as possible. She came up with reasons to be out late, dodging his questions with half-hearted excuses. Michael, absorbed in his work as usual, didn't seem to notice the shift in her behavior at first, but as the days passed, the distance between them grew more pronounced. Ava found herself lying to him without a second thought, justifying her actions as she sank deeper into her relationship with Julian. The passion between her and Julian burned hotter with each encounter. They couldn't keep their hands off each other, each touch laced with desire and longing. Ava craved the thrill of being with him, the way he made her feel alive again. The guilt she once felt began to fade, replaced by the intoxicating allure of Julian's promises. But beneath the surface of their passionate affair, there was an undercurrent of something darker. Julian's words, once filled with sweetness and promises, began to take on a more insistent tone. "You deserve better, Ava," he would remind her, his voice low and persuasive. "Michael will never make you happy. You know that." And every time, Ava found it harder to argue. She was falling deeper into Julian's world, and with each passing day, the thought of leaving Michael didn't seem so impossible. But little did she know, the price of her newfound happiness would be far greater than she could have imagined. Ava stood at the edge of her living room, staring out of the window as the evening light slowly faded into dusk. The house felt colder these days, emptier despite Michael's presence. He sat in his usual spot, absorbed in his work, tapping away on his laptop like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Ava's mind was filled with thoughts of Julian, the man who had awakened something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. The man who, with every touch, every kiss, convinced her that she deserved better than the hollow life she was living. It was late when Julian called that night. "I need to see you." His voice came through the phone, smooth and compelling. "Come over." Ava didn't hesitate, finding yet another excuse to slip out of the house unnoticed. The thrill of seeing him again, of feeling his hands on her body, overpowered her guilt. She drove to his apartment, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. When she arrived, Julian greeted her at the door, pulling her into a deep, passionate kiss before she could even speak. His touch was demanding, and Ava melted into his embrace, allowing him to lead her to the bedroom. Their clothes were shed in a frenzy of desire, the world outside forgotten as they became lost in each other. The sex was different that night. It was rougher, more intense, as if Julian was trying to claim her in a way he hadn't before. His hands gripped her harder. His kisses were more aggressive, and Ava felt herself surrendering to him completely. Every time she tried to think, to pull back, his touch would bring her crashing back into the present moment, drowning out all her doubts. Later, as they lay together in the aftermath, Julian's fingers lazily traced circles on her bare skin. The room was filled with a heavy silence, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Julian's voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it. "You know this can't go on like this forever." Her body stiffened. She knew what he meant, but she wasn't ready to hear it. "Michael," he continued, his tone darkening. "He's holding you back. He's controlling you. Ava, you deserve more than this, more than him." Ava swallowed hard, her heart racing as she listened to him. Julian had been planting these thoughts in her head for weeks, slowly convincing her that Michael was the reason she felt so trapped, so unfulfilled. But now, his words took on a more sinister edge. "He'll never let you go," Julian said, his hand tightening on her waist. "Not unless he's out of the picture." Ava's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling as she processed what he was saying. Julian's eyes were fixed on her, his gaze intense and unyielding. "You don't mean that?" Ava whispered, her voice trembling. Julian sat up, turning to face her fully. "I do. We can't be together unless he's gone. Ava, you know that. He'll fight you every step of the way. He'll make your life miserable. But if he wasn't around, you and I could have everything." Ava's chest tightened as the weight of his words settled over her. Was he really suggesting what she thought he was? The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, a part of her had already been considering the possibility. Michael wouldn't just let her go. He tried to control her, to keep her under his thumb, just like he always had. But murder, she wasn't capable of that, was she? "I can't," Ava started, her voice shaky. "I can't do that, Julian. I can't kill him." Julian reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the darkness in his words. "You won't have to," he whispered. "I'll take care of everything. All you have to do is agree. We'll make it look like an accident. No one will ever know." Ava felt like she was spinning, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She loved Julian, or at least she thought she did, and she hated the life she had with Michael. But murder, this was too much. "Think about it," Julian continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. "We can have the life we've always dreamed of. You'll be free. Free to love me, to be with me, without looking over your shoulder. Don't you want that?" His words lingered in the air, tempting her, pulling her deeper into his web. Ava was torn between the love she thought she had for Julian and the reality of what he was asking her to do. The passion between them was undeniable, the sex they shared only growing more intense as the stakes got higher. But this was different. This wasn't just about passion and desire anymore, this was about life and death. Over the next few days, Julian's words echoed in her mind. He continued to seduce her, both physically and emotionally, drawing her in with promises of a better life. Every time they were together, he used their connection to weaken her resolve, pushing her closer to the edge. Ava found herself avoiding Michael more than ever. She couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't bring herself to talk to him without feeling the weight of her betrayal. The lies came easier now, rolling off her tongue without hesitation. And with every lie, Julian's suggestion seemed less impossible. But Ava wasn't blind to the change in Julian. He had grown more possessive, more controlling, as if her hesitation was an insult to his plans. There were moments when she saw the darker side of him, the man who wasn't just offering her love, but demanding her loyalty in the most dangerous way possible. One evening, as she sat alone in her car, parked outside Julian's apartment, Ava stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had to make a decision. Michael or Julian, her old life or the new one Julian was promising. But there was no escaping the truth. No matter which path she chose, there would be no going back. And as the darkness of night fell around her, Ava realized that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, with Julian waiting on the other side. All she had to do was jump. The night was colder than usual. Ava sat in her kitchen, the dim light from the stove casting eerie shadows on the walls. The weight of Julian's plan hung heavy on her, pressing against her chest like an invisible force. She could barely breathe, her thoughts racing with the enormity of what was about to happen. This wasn't supposed to be real. It was a fantasy, an escape. But now, as Julian's words echoed in her mind, she knew there was no turning back. She was in too deep. Julian's plan had been too simple. A break-in, he said. Something that would make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Michael wouldn't see it coming. Julian had reassured her that everything would be quick, painless. Ava didn't need to do anything. All she had to do was act natural, keep to her routine, and pretend nothing was amiss. But tonight, everything felt wrong. Julian had insisted she stay home, to keep her distance so there would be no suspicion. He had it all under control, or so he claimed. Ava had agreed, though every fiber of her being wanted to stop this madness. Her phone vibrated in her hand, a message from Julian. "It's done. Come over, Dot." Ava's heart raced as she left the house, her footsteps quick and nervous. The streets were deserted, the night eerily quiet. By the time she arrived at Julian's apartment, her stomach churned with a sickening mixture of fear and anticipation. Julian opened the door, his face unreadable. Without a word, he pulled her inside, closing the door behind her. She stood there, frozen, unable to speak, her eyes searching his for any sign of reassurance. "He's dead," Julian said calmly, as though he were discussing the weather. The room spun. Ava's knees gave way and she collapsed into a chair. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Dead Michael was dead. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Julian knelt in front of her, his hands sliding up her thighs, drawing her attention back to him. "It's over, Ava," he murmured. "You're free now." But the words didn't bring her comfort. They filled her with dread. She had expected relief, a sense of liberation, but instead there was only guilt, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. "Julian," her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't think it would be like this." He leaned in, kissing her softly, trying to distract her, to pull her back into his orbit. His hands moved over her body, his touch familiar and insistent. Ava wanted to pull away, to scream, to make it all stop, but she couldn't. She was trapped by her choices, by her desire, by the man who had consumed her life. They tumbled into bed, their bodies moving together with a frantic desperation. But this time, the passion wasn't enough to drown out the horror. Every touch felt wrong, every kiss tainted with the memory of what they had done. Julian's hands were rougher, his grip tighter, as though he was trying to exert control over her, over the situation. Ava let him take her, her mind numb, her body going through the motions. Sex had always been their escape, their way of connecting in a world that felt disconnected. But now, it felt like a prison, like a way for Julian to keep her chained to him, bound by the terrible secret they now shared. Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Ava stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Julian's arms were draped over her, but she felt no comfort in his embrace. Instead, she felt suffocated, trapped by the very man who had promised her freedom. "Everything will be fine," Julian whispered, as though sensing her unease. "No one will suspect a thing. It looks like a robbery gone wrong." Ava wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could just move on, that this would all disappear. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Michael's death wouldn't just vanish. The police would investigate, questions would be asked. And what if something went wrong? What if they found out? Julian leaned over her, his lips brushing against her neck, his voice low and seductive. "We did this for us, Ava, for our future. I don't let guilt ruin that. You wanted this." Ava's stomach churned. She had wanted to be free, but not like this. She hadn't wanted murder. She hadn't wanted blood on her hands. "I didn't," "I didn't think it would be like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Julian's expression hardened, his charm slipping for just a moment. "I don't start doubting now. Ava, we're in this together. You're mine now." That was the moment it hit her. Ava realized she had made a terrible mistake. Julian wasn't her savior. He wasn't her escape. He was a manipulator, a man who had used her vulnerabilities, her desires, to pull her into his dark world. She was trapped by him, by her own choices, by the guilt that gnawed at her soul. But there was no going back now. Michael was dead, and Ava had helped make it happen. The realization washed over her, cold and suffocating. Julian had used her, seduced her with promises of a better life, but all he had given her was a nightmare. As she lay in bed beside him, Julian drifting off to sleep, Ava stared into the darkness, her mind racing. She was complicit. She was guilty. And now, there was no escape from the life she had chosen. But one thought kept gnawing at her. If Julian had manipulated her into killing her husband, what else was he capable of? And how far was he willing to go to keep control over her? The night grew darker, and Ava, lost in her thoughts, realized that the nightmare was far from over. The morning after Michael's death felt surreal to Ava. The world outside her window looked the same, people going about their lives, the sun rising over the horizon, but everything had changed. She sat at the kitchen table, numb, the weight of her guilt and fear pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. Michael was dead, and she had helped make it happen. A knock on the door jolted her out of her daze. 2 detectives stood on the porch, their faces grave and professional. "Mrs. Ava, we need to ask you a few questions about your husband's death," one of them said, his voice polite but firm. Ava's heart raced. She had prepared herself for this moment, rehearsed her lines in her head, but now that it was here, she felt unprepared, vulnerable. Julian had reassured her over and over again that everything would be fine, that the police wouldn't suspect them, but deep down, Ava wasn't so sure. The detectives sat across from her, their eyes scanning her every move. "Can you tell us where you were the night your husband was killed?" the first detective asked, flipping open his notebook. Ava swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. "I was at home," she lied, her voice shaky. "Michael, he went out late. I don't know why. When I woke up in the morning, he was gone." The second detective tilted his head slightly. "And you didn't hear anything unusual? No sounds during the night?" Ava shook her head, her pulse quickening. "No, nothing. I thought he was working late." The questions continued, each one probing deeper into the night of the murder. Ava answered as best she could, but her nerves were getting the best of her. She could feel the detective's eyes on her, watching for any slip-up, any sign of guilt. And then one of them asked the question she had been dreading. "Did your husband have any enemies, Mrs. Ava? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Ava's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, and in that brief moment, she could feel the detective zeroing in on her uncertainty. "No," she whispered. "Not that I know of." The interview ended with a polite "thank you," but Ava knew better. The detectives weren't finished with her. They were just getting started. As they left, her mind raced, replaying every word, every lie she had told. Would they believe her? Could they see through her facade? When Julian called later that day, Ava was a mess. "The police were here," she blurted out as soon as she picked up the phone. "They're asking questions. What if they find out? What if they suspect me?" Julian's voice was calm, reassuring. "Relax. Ava, they have nothing on you. We were careful. Just stick to the story, and everything will be fine." But Ava wasn't convinced. The guilt was eating her alive, and with each passing hour, she felt the walls closing in. What if Julian was wrong? What if the police were already piecing together the truth? As the days passed, the investigation intensified. Detectives returned with more questions, their tone growing more pointed, more suspicious. They had started looking into her relationship with Julian, noticing how much time they had spent together in the weeks leading up to Michael's death. Ava tried to maintain her innocence, but the pressure was mounting. And Julian was changing. The man who had once been her escape, her passionate lover, was becoming cold, distant. He snapped at her more often, his once gentle touch turning rough. Ava started to see the cracks in his charming facade. The way he looked at her now sent chills down her spine, a hint of something darker lurking behind his eyes. One evening, after another tense conversation with the detectives, Ava confronted Julian. "Did you ever love me? Or was this all just a game to you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Julian's expression was unreadable. He walked toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Of course I loved you, Ava," he said softly, though there was no warmth in his voice. "But we both know what needed to be done. Michael was in the way. Now he's gone and we're free. Ava's heart sank. Julian's words were cold, calculated. She had been a pawn in his game from the very beginning, manipulated into believing that they could be together, that Michael's death was the only way. But now she realized too late that Julian had orchestrated everything. He had never cared about her, only about getting rid of Michael. That night, as she lay in bed, Ava's mind raced. The guilt was unbearable, her betrayal of Michael gnawing at her soul. And yet, she was more terrified of Julian now than she was of the police. She had seen the darkness inside him, the ruthlessness with which he had manipulated her, and she feared what he might do next. The police were closing in, and Ava knew that time was running out. But she also knew that Julian wouldn't let her go easily. She was trapped, caught between the law and a man who was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The next morning, the detectives returned, their expressions more serious than before. "We found some inconsistencies in your story," Mrs. Ava, one of them said, his tone sharp. "We'd like you to come down to the station for further questioning." Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. Julian's voice echoed in her mind, "We're in this together, Dot." But now, as the police closed in and the truth threatened to unravel, Ava realized that she might be facing this nightmare alone. Ava could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her as the police continued their investigation. Every time they called her in for questioning, the guilt gnawed at her more fiercely. The lies she had told to cover up Michael's murder were unraveling, and with each passing day, Ava felt herself slipping further into despair. But worst of all was Julian, cold, distant, and more dangerous than ever. One night, Julian stormed into Ava's home. His face was tense, his eyes dark. "We need to leave," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "The police are getting too close. If we don't disappear now, they'll catch us." Ava stared at him, the man she had once believed to be her savior, now nothing more than a manipulative monster. She had risked everything for him, and now he wanted to leave her behind. The realization cut through her like a knife. Julian had never intended to stay with her. He had used her from the beginning, and now he was trying to escape, leaving her to take the fall for Michael's murder. "I'm not running," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't live the rest of my life on the run for you." Julian's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't be stupid. Ava, they'll throw you in prison. Do you want to rot in a cell for the rest of your life?" But something in Ava had shifted. She no longer feared Julian as she once did. She realized now that her love for him had been an illusion, a fantasy built on lies and manipulation, and she had paid the ultimate price, losing Michael and her innocence to a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. Ava knew what she had to do. The guilt and fear that had been consuming her gave way to a new emotion: revenge. That night, Ava went to the police station. Her hands trembled as she entered, but her resolve was strong. She had made her decision. She sat down with the lead detective, her voice steady as she made her confession. "I have information about my husband's murder," Ava said, her voice calm. "It wasn't just me. Julian was involved. He manipulated me, pressured me, and planned everything." The detectives listened intently as Ava revealed the full truth. She explained how Julian had seduced her, how he had planted the idea of murder in her mind, and how he had orchestrated the entire schemes to eliminate Michael. She gave them details that only the real perpetrators would know, solidifying her credibility. In exchange for her cooperation, the police offered Ava a plea deal. She would face a lighter sentence in exchange for testifying against Julian. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Julian had done to her, but Ava knew it was the only way to regain control of her life. She had loved him once fiercely, passionately, but now she would make sure he paid for what he had done. The next morning, the police raided Julian's hideout. Julian, realizing too late that Ava had turned against him, tried to escape, but the authorities were waiting. Within moments, he was handcuffed and taken into custody. In the courtroom, Ava watched as Julian was brought to trial. She testified against him, her voice unwavering as she recounted the details of their affair, the manipulation, and the murder. Julian glared at her from across the room, fury in his eyes, but Ava no longer cared. She had made her choice. Julian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom buzzed as the verdict was read, but for Ava, there was no sense of triumph, only a deep, hollow ache. She had won her revenge, but at what cost? Ava, due to her cooperation, received a lighter sentence, several years in prison, but far less than Julian's. As she was led away, she realized she would never truly be free. The guilt of her betrayal of Michael, of falling for Julian's lies, and of being complicit in her husband's death would haunt her forever. In the quiet of her cell, Ava often found herself thinking of Michael, how she had betrayed him, how she had let her life spiral so far out of control. And though Julian was gone, imprisoned for his crimes, Ava knew she would always carry the weight of what she had done. Her punishment wasn't just the years behind bars, it was the knowledge that she had destroyed everything she once held dear for a man who had never truly loved her.